My sister begged me to cancel our vacation and babysit her kids. What happened next shattered our family, exposed secrets, and forced me to choose between love and my self-respect. I remember standing in the airport parking lot with my suitcase handle digging into my palm and Matteo squeezing my hand like he was trying to pass calm through his fingers. We had saved for this trip for months. It was not a honeymoon, just a week by the sea where we could sleep late and eat cheap sandwiches without guilt. Less than an hour before we planned to leave, my phone buzzed with a message from Camila. Her text began sweet. "Danny, can you do me a huge favor? Johan and I have a trip and we can't take the girls." She added heart emojis as if she were asking about a dress. I typed that I loved them and that we would miss the girls, then put the phone away. I have learned to be careful when plans change suddenly. Matteo watched me and asked if I wanted to respond. I shook my head. Camila and I were close as children. We shared secrets, dreams, and a stubborn belief that we would always support one another. When she met Johan, things shifted. Money changed the rhythm of her life. Comfort became central and she began to defer to his preferences. I watched her accept easier paths instead of insisting on what she truly wanted. I wrote back gently. "I'm sorry, Cam, but Matteo and I planned this. We saved for it." Her reply was quick. "You don't have kids, Danny. Mom and Dad are on my side. It is only fair." My mother called shortly after. "Danny, your sister needs you," she said. "Your father, and I think you should help." Matteo tightened his grip on my wrist. The guilt piled up. At first Camila tried kindness. She stopped by with cupcakes and said, "You are such a good aunt." The tone shifted soon after. "You know how much this trip means to me," she told me. "Johan does not want the girls on his vacations." That sentence made the stakes clear. Johan set the rules and Camila followed them. When I refused, things changed. Conversations at home became tense. My parents took Camila's side, worried about what would happen if she lost her marriage. Their fear sounded practical to them but coercive to me. Since when did my life become a solution to their anxiety? Matteo was my refuge. We listed reasons like 2 people protecting a budget. We had worked for those days off, I needed rest, and it was not my responsibility to fix another marriage. "We go," he said. His support felt like armor. Even so, guilt lingered because the ask came from family. We went. The beach helped. Sleep, small breakfasts, and slow afternoons unspooled the tension for a while. I told myself boundaries were the right thing. But the messages did not stop. Camila moved from polite requests to urgent pleas. "This is just once," she wrote. When we returned, the situation had escalated. Camila came to the door angry and tearful. Words snapped. In a moment of rage she slapped me and left with her daughters. The slap left more than a physical mark, it tore at the history between us. Neighbors watched, my parents called, and the house felt oddly empty. Later, truth surfaced. Johan had traveled with someone else. The divorce followed. Camila reached out months later with a smaller voice. She thanked me in a way that sounded like apology and acceptance. She was hurting but had her daughters. That made me feel a small relief. I replay choices in my head. Could I have been kinder in my refusal? Maybe. But saying no was not cruelty. It was protecting what Matteo and I had built together. The hurt that followed was real, but the boundary kept our life intact. I still think of Camila and the years we shared. I answer some messages and leave others unread. Boundaries are messy and necessary. This is not a story of heroes and villains. It is a portrait of family, choices, and the imperfect ways we love one another. I write this to remind myself that saying no can be an act of self-respect. I left for the trip with Matteo despite Camila's insistence that I stay home and take care of her 2 girls. She started politely, asking as if it were a small favor, then moved to pressuring our parents to back her. Matteo stood by me, and we went to the beach. When we came back the conflict escalated and Camila ended up slapping me in a fight. Since then things have been unraveling between us and our family. At first, Camila's approach was almost tender. She showed up with cookies, soft tones and a laugh that made the demand sound like a casual ask between sisters. "It's only for a week," she would say, like she was requesting a sweater and not handing me a week of childcare and emotional labor. Her voice had that practiced warmth that made you want to help. I remember telling myself that maybe I could do one small thing to keep the peace, and then catching myself, this was not a small thing. She was meticulous in the way she framed it. She talked about how the trip would do wonders for her mood, how her husband's work schedule made this the only time they could go. She layered the favor with compliments. You're always so generous, you're great with the girls, as if flattery could become a substitute for respect. That opening charm gradually hardened into entitlement. When my no stayed firm, Camila pivoted to logistics. She described the hotel, the itinerary, the flights with a mix of glee and pleading. She said casually, "You don't have kids, Danny. You can stay." That statement, tossed like a fact, felt like a small war zone landmine. It assumed my availability and ignored the life Mateo and I had planned. It turned my choices into a void, something she could fill. The first time she tried to rope the parents in, it was quiet and covert. She would call Mom late at night and leave 2-word messages that made Mom worry. Mom started asking indirect questions. Are you sure you don't mind? And wouldn't you be comfortable helping just this once? Their tone betrayed them. It was sympathy for someone they feared losing to an unstable marriage, not a neutral assessment of fairness. Camila had rehearsed those lines, and she used them like tools. I tried to explain calmly, this isn't just about childcare. Mateo and I saved for this, and I need time to rest. I gave reasons, not excuses. But reasons can sound like obstacles to someone determined. Camila increased pressure slowly, the classic escalation tactic. It wasn't angry at first. It was persistence dressed as practicality. She sent messages like, "If you really loved me you'd help," which sharply blurred love with obligation. Each message inched the boundary. Each plea landed like a pebble. There were small manipulative moves that stung more because they were subtle. She would describe scenes she wanted to experience, a certain cafe, the way the light hit a cathedral, in a tone that made me complicit in her dreams. She knew how to make me feel like a participant in her joy instead of the person being asked to sacrifice. When she realized charm wasn't enough, she escalated to guilt. She introduced comparisons. "When we were kids, you always helped me," she'd say. That line held history hostage. It implied that past kindnesses create a permanent debt. I kept thinking of our childhood, of how we shared toys and secrets and scraped knees. But adult obligations are not IOUs for affection. Still, the phrase lodged in my head. Memory is a powerful manipulator. At other times she weaponized fear. "If I don't go on this trip, Johan will be upset. He gets difficult." She painted a picture in which failing to comply could fracture her marriage. That argument played on my empathy. Who wants to feel responsible for someone else's potential heartbreak? The subtle threat, that she might be abandoned, pressed on my conscience. It was a tactic designed to force a choice by making the alternative unbearable. When that didn't work, Camila changed tone. Her messages became sharper, less coy. She sent a list of tasks the girls would need help with, written like a contract. Morning routine, lunch, school drop-off. The details made it real. She began to treat my refusal as a logistical problem to be solved, not a decision to be respected. Small demands turned into a checklist that implied I had no life of my own. I kept resisting, because resistance was not merely obstinacy, it was a line in the sand for the life Mateo and I had created. He and I had put time, energy and money into that trip. It represented rest, recovery and a rare pocket of time for us. Besides, I loved my sister, but I also had limits. Saying no was painful but necessary. Mateo was steadfast. "We worked for this," he told her once over the phone in a voice that was both polite and immovable. His steadiness gave me courage. Camila then used our parents differently. She framed the situation as a problem their daughter could solve. "Danny can help," she told them. She never said, "Danny should help." The word choice made the plea sound voluntary to the outside ear but coercive behind closed doors. Mom and Dad visited my house with soft faces and harder questions, like sheriffs with sympathetic eyes. "We just want the family to stay together," my father said, and for them that meant smoothing over Johan's whims. Their intervention felt like betrayal. It was disorienting to watch the people who raised me reduce my boundaries to inconveniences. I explained, measuredly, my reasons. I tried to get them to see that my decision wasn't about being unhelpful, but about fairness and autonomy. My father's worry about Camila's marriage was genuine, but it felt like they were prioritizing appearances over my agency. In private, Camila employed another technique, emotional arithmetic. She would say things like, "If you miss this, I'll never forget it." She counted favors like currency. The transactional language made every refusal look like a debt. I found myself replaying things I had done for her, small favors, drives in the night, lending money, and feeling exhausted by the ledger she kept open. Love shouldn't have an invoice. One evening she cornered me between errands and spoke quickly, with that old softness. "Look, Danny," she said, "I need you. Please." Her eyes looked tired in a way that made me ache, but ache is not always an answer. I pictured Mateo waiting in the car and thought of the plans we had made. I pictured my limits. I said no again. There were consequences. She grew colder in group texts, removed herself from family gatherings, and treated me with a brittle politeness that felt like glass. The siblings' camaraderie we had once relied on eroded as Camila hardened into a person who calculated favors and measured loyalty with a ruler. At the same time, I felt a strange clarity. The escalation exposed who she had become, someone willing to prioritize a trip and her husband's comfort over the emotional cost to others. Looking back, the manipulation had layers: charm, guilt, fear, comparison, and tactical escalation to the parents. It was sophisticated, and it was painfully effective on people who wanted to avoid conflict. I held my line because Mateo and I had a contract with ourselves, to protect our time and our peace. The refusal did not make me callous, it made me human. The conflict didn't resolve. It festered. My parents grew anxious, Camila grew resentful, and the family dynamic shifted in ways I hadn't anticipated. I kept writing small messages trying to explain, and sometimes they landed, sometimes they were ignored. When I think about that time now, what stands out is how ordinary the manipulation felt until it wasn't. It took many little moves for the pattern to emerge. I learned that some people escalate because they can, and some people give in because they cannot face another fight. I chose the fight, and I still wake up to the consequences. I saved for a week away with Mateo and left despite Camila's persistent pleas that I stay home and care for her 2 girls. She moved from charm to pressure, involved our parents, and when I returned tensions exploded into a physical confrontation. The family is fractured and things are still unfolding. When my parents finally asked to sit down, I felt the knot that had lived in my chest since everything began. My father spoke first with a steady voice and said, "We worry about Camila. We think this trip might be important to their marriage." My mother added softly, "We are just afraid she might lose him." I listened and tried to separate their fear from accusation. It was difficult because their concern folded into a demand that my boundaries be sacrificed for the sake of a shaky marriage. I explained gently that Mateo and I had planned and saved for the vacation and that it was important for our relationship. They nodded, but I could see the lines of people who had rehearsed their responses. My father leaned forward and said, "We know you love her. Maybe helping this once could prevent something worse." Their logic sounded reasonable until it became clear what they meant by helping. They were asking me to give up a week of my life for what they perceived as a long-term risk. When my mother whispered that Johan would leave Camila if she disappointed him, her voice shook. That admission opened a new layer of pressure. They sounded terrified and they wanted someone to fix it. That declaration forced me to confront a painful question: was I responsible for another adult's relationship? My answer was no. I told them that their worry did not automatically make my life the safety net for Camila's marriage. My refusal was not born from indifference, but from a clear sense of limits and fairness. I could not be the person charged with holding their daughter's life together. My father's expression changed from urgency to reflection. He admitted that he had always feared Camila might choose comfort over resilience. He had watched her adapt to easier paths and worried she would struggle if left to fend for herself. His fear explained their actions but did not erase the burden they were trying to place on me. We spoke at length. I told them how betrayed I felt when they aligned their worries with a demand. I told them that rerouting their anxiety toward me was damaging and unfair. In turn, they shared their vulnerability, the fear of failing as parents and the panic that comes when you imagine your child abandoned. It was a raw and honest conversation and at times, painfully intimate. At one point my mother reached for my hand and said, "We thought you could keep things together." Her voice was small and haunted. That plea was less a condemnation and more a confession of their own fear. Recognizing that softened the edges of the talk. I appreciated the honesty even if I did not accept the request. That evening Matteo and I spoke late into the night. He asked practical questions that helped me anchor my response. What matters most to you? What would you be willing to compromise? We reviewed what the vacation meant to us: rest, reconnection, and a rare chance to be alone without family drama. He reminded me gently that we had built a life together and that protecting that life was not selfish. "We are the family we chose," he said, and those words steadied me. With new clarity, I asked for one more meeting with my parents where I could speak without them trying to fix everything for me. I wanted them to be honest about their motivations. In that meeting, my father admitted something unexpected. Part of their push had come from embarrassment. Not a public shame, he explained, but the private kind of failure parents feel when they worry they did not prepare a child to be independent. He feared Camila's reliance on Johan reflected on them. That confession shifted the conversation. If their request came from a desire to avoid judgment, then it was less about rescuing Camila and more about preserving an image of family stability. I suggested alternatives that would support Camila without making me the scapegoat. What if we help her find practical resources? I asked. What if you and I offer childcare only when it fits our lives, or help her connect with counseling and community support? They asked honest questions. What can we do? How can we support her without asking too much of you? I proposed concrete steps. They could arrange a schedule of support that did not revolve around my availability. They could accompany Camila to appointments or help her find a therapist or a parenting group. They could also gently speak up with Johan when his behavior worried them. To my relief, they agreed to try. They did not promise perfection and they did not erase the hurt they had caused, but they recognized that putting the burden on me was unfair. My mother said, "We were scared and we reacted. We will try to do better." Hearing that felt closer to an apology than anything I had heard before. In the weeks that followed, we began to change habits. My parents stopped framing their concerns as ultimatums and started offering specific, limited help. They began to call Johan when they were worried and to suggest therapy for Camila. They helped with tasks they could reasonably manage and stopped defaulting to me as the solution. Camila's reaction to these shifts was complicated. At first she resisted. Years of accommodation to Johan's preferences had made independence seem like an impossible stretch. But when the pressure stopped being redirected toward me, her resistance softened. She accepted some practical help and agreed to meet with a counselor my mother recommended. I will not romanticize the progress. There were relapses and setbacks. Silence filled some rooms, and there were days when I missed the sister who had been my confidant. Still, watching my parents begin to take responsibility felt like a relief. It redirected the family's energy from blaming me to actually helping Camila build skills and resources. One evening my mother called to tell me Camila had attended her first support group meeting. "It's early," she said, "but it's a start." I felt a cautious hope. The immediate pressure on my marriage eased, and the family began to look like it might realign around more sustainable support structures. As this part of the story closes, there are no final guarantees. The family dynamic has shifted and the lines of loyalty have been redrawn. I learned that insisting on boundaries can open space for others to change, but it does not erase pain. Love sometimes requires being firm, even when it hurts those you love. After a long push from Camila, her charm turning to pressure and then to confrontation, I left for the planned vacation with Matteo. My parents worried about Camila's marriage and initially pressed me to help, but after honest conversations they started offering practical support. Tensions remained, and the family dynamic shifted. Now, I finally met with Camila to say what I needed to say. This is what happened next. The morning of the confrontation felt heavy like humidity before a storm. The vacation was hours away, which made the timing brutal. The trip had become an island of promised peace, and everything else was crashing against it. I had rehearsed lines in my head, but rehearsals never capture the heat when someone you love looks at you and expects an explanation. We sat in her kitchen because it was always neutral ground for us when things were serious. Her daughters were at school and Matteo had insisted on waiting in the car until I was finished, standing guard, which felt oddly protective and also oddly polite in a family argument. Camila poured coffee with an unsteady hand. For a moment she seemed smaller than the person I had been wrestling with in my head. She looked tired and scared in a way that loosened something in my chest, but I kept my focus. I started with the facts in the calmest voice I could manage. Camila, I love you and I've always tried to help, but I can't be the fallback that keeps a marriage together. Mateo and I planned this trip. We saved for it. We needed it. Saying those sentences out loud made them feel less like an assault and more like boundaries forming a shape around my life. She listened at first, then everything changed. The tiredness in her face sharpened into something edged and defensive. You don't understand, she said. This is our chance. Johan needs this to be happy. There was that word again, need, as though survival hinged on a week away. It sounded huge and impossible. I told her what I'd told our parents. I get scared for you too, but protecting your marriage can't be my life. You have to stand up for your own needs. I spoke plainly about the pattern I had seen, the way she deferred to Johan and how her choices seemed to fold into his preferences. I won't be the one to bail you out of a marriage that needs fixing, I said. She reacted the way someone confronted with a mirror sometimes does, quickly and with hurt. You think I want this? She snapped. You think I like doing what he asks? Her voice broke, and for a second I saw the girl who had once leaned against my shoulder. You never asked me what it was like, she said. It was a plea and an accusation braided together. I answered honestly. I'm not saying you want it, Cam. I'm saying the dynamic worries me. And I'm saying I can't keep paying the price for it. There was silence after that, a strange thick pause where the kitchen clock sounded like a judge. The moment I had dreaded arrived. She stood up abruptly, stepping closer until the distance between us felt like a charged wire. You've been judging me, she whispered. You act like you're better. That stung. I thought about everything I had done for her, every midnight drive and every small favor, and realized how quickly the ledger had been rewritten. I tried to keep the conversation from collapsing into blame. I'm not judging, Camila. I'm worried. I want you to be okay, not to be stuck. But she had already made a decision about who I was in that room. The old sisterly language was gone. There was something brittle in her that had been forged through years of choosing the easier path to avoid conflict with Johan. Then suddenly she slapped me. The movement was quick and almost disbelief-making because it came from someone who wore softness like a garment. My cheek burned and the whole house seemed to tilt. The sound of the slap hung in the air as if time had decided to stop and take notes. She left the house, taking her daughters with her, and before she shut the car door she said, "Save your lectures. I don't need them." The door closed like a full stop. I sat down slowly, the kitchen chair making that small scrape against the tile. The anger hit after the shock, a hot, righteous anger that had nothing to do with the slap itself and everything to do with what it meant. She had crossed a line and chosen a narrative that painted me as the enemy. My mind raced with the conversation I wanted to have, the soft questions and the sharp truths. Instead I left, walked to Mateo, and we drove away with a mix of sorrow and relief. The vacation was quieter than we had expected. There were moments of laughter, slow walks on sand, and ridiculous sandwiches eaten with ridiculous satisfaction. But there were also quieter seams in the day where my thoughts returned to Camila and the slap, to the parents' worry, and to what responsibility really looked like. Mateo was patient in that way that made me feel steadier. He listened without needing to fix everything. News reached me while we were away. Johan had taken a trip, publicly listed as solo travel, and the kind of vacation that looked like a trophy rather than a necessity. Social media pictures showed him at fancy restaurants, at places I had heard Camila describe in longing tones. The discrepancy between his posts and what he had told the family felt like a betrayal that needed to be named. I showed Mateo the posts, and we sat with the knowledge that the story was probably worse than any of us had suspected. When we returned, the house felt different. Camila had stopped answering calls. My parents were more careful when they called, a hesitance in their voices that suggested the conversation had moved from urgent to fragile. A week after our return, a family member texted me a picture, Johan on a beach with another woman, smiling as if the world were a stage. That image clarified a truth that had been suspended in rumors and thin statements. The lie had finally been visualized. Confrontation turned to consequences. The divorce process began slowly at first, a legal paperwork rhythm that took a while to start but gained momentum like a train leaving a station. Camila reached out months later in a soft message, a mixture of apology and something that sounded like grief. "I'm sorry," she wrote. "You were right. I didn't want to hear it then." The admission felt small and immense at the same time. We met a few times after that. The conversations were awkward, marked with long pauses where the ease we once had should have been. She thanked me in a way that sounded like an attempt to reweave our relationship from the frayed edges. "If you hadn't said what you said," she told me once, "I don't know if I would have seen it. I was so used to smoothing things over that I didn't notice how little control I had." Those words landed like small stones in a stream, creating ripples that washed the bed differently as time moved. She was depressed for a while, as the end of a marriage can render the world a gray place even when it's ultimately the right choice. There were days she called and we talked about practical things, school pickups, broken light bulbs, and days when she didn't answer. The girls were her North Star, every conversation turned toward them, which made the hard part softer. I paused before helping because boundary work doesn't mean abandoning basic human decency. My parents shifted too. The fear that had made them err toward coercion became, with time and hard conversations, a kind of humility. They apologized for the pressure they had put on me. It wasn't theatrical or dramatic, it was a steady, quiet undoing of assumptions. "We were scared," my mother said simply. "Thank you for holding your ground." That apology was not a trump card that fixed everything, but it opened a new channel for conversation that didn't revolve around rescue. In the months that followed, I noticed small, detailed shifts that mattered in ways that weren't flashy but mattered all the same. There were afternoons when I picked up the girls and they ran into my arms without asking why the world had bent the way it did. There was a school recital where Camila sat in the front row and clapped the loudest, her face bright for a child who practiced violin pieces with slow stubbornness. At that recital, my mother squeezed my hand across the pew and mouthed, "Thank you," and for a second the old tension softened. Camila started therapy and it was messy, like unfastening a knot you didn't notice was tied. She spoke about her fear of confrontation and how once she started losing the habit of seeking approval from a man, the world felt unstable. That therapy wasn't a miracle cure, but it was a practice ground where she learned to say, "I want," without tacking on the obligation to please. When she told me about the first time she said no to Johan, even about something small, like what they would have for dinner, she sounded proud in a quiet way that made me feel like we were witnessing a small reclamation. We adopted new rituals. Once a month my parents, Camila, the girls, Mateo and I tried to have dinner where the rule was practical talk only, no accusations, no guilt. We came with lists, doctor's appointments, school crafts, who could pick up in a pinch. It felt functional and slightly boring, which was precisely what we needed. The boredom meant stability. It meant the family could manage without turning emotional pressure into a currency. There were setbacks. The first time there was a chance meeting with Johan after the separation, the air thickened with hurt and old dynamics flirted with reappearance. Camila texted me later, "He looked like he owned the place." In that text line there was grief and also, oddly, a measure of relief. Seeing him outside the marriage made his power less mystical and more mundane. The mundane is easier to live with than myth. One day my mother told me a story I hadn't expected. She had gone through her old diary pages and found entries where she had once written fears about failing as a parent. "We thought we were helping," she said, her voice small. "We didn't see how we were asking too much." She also confessed she had resented not being able to fix everything, and that resentment had made her quick to request my intervention as a band-aid. That level of introspection, not performed for drama, but used for change, shifted how she showed up. Camila thanked me directly a few times, but the most meaningful moments were quieter. Once, after a long night with the girls, she left a note on my kitchen table, "You were right. Thank you for not letting me stay small." It was hardly a formal apology, but it was a line that reframed the story. Another time she baked a batch of brownies and walked them over with her girls, who hugged me like the world was right again. These small gestures were the stitches of a slowly mending fabric. I also learned to forgive myself. For a long time I carried a ghostly script that said boundaries were selfish. I had to relearn that protecting the life my husband and I built was a form of care. That isn't pure absolution, it's a practical moral stance. When Camila thanked me, I accepted it but also knew that her gratitude didn't erase the difficulty. It simply marked a point of forward movement. Publicly, things smoothed out over time. Family gatherings stopped being minefields of implied obligations and started to resemble, imperfectly, shared meals. We weren't back to normal in the nostalgic sense, We were back to a functional, careful version of togetherness. Camila still had days when the weight of the divorce made her retreat. On those days I tried to be present in small, non-invasive ways: a text asking about school projects, a dropped-off casserole, a ride to an appointment. Johan's divorce unfolded with its own legal slow-motion rhythm. He contested some items and walked away from others. There were court dates and statements that felt clinical and final. It was strange to watch the person who had seemed so powerful in our family gossip lose his grip like a man letting go of a prop. The finality of that legal process brought a kind of closure we hadn't had before, and it allowed Camila to begin imagining a life that wasn't curated by someone else's preferences. For me, the biggest lesson was about language. How we use words like help, favor, and support matters. When family uses those words as shorthand for emotional labor, it's easy for a single person to become the default caregiver at the cost of their own plans. Naming those dynamics changed the conversation. It made the invisible visible. That was necessary for any real change. Now, when I visit family, there is a more practical choreography. We coordinate care for the girls in schedules that don't demand miracles from one person. My parents have regained a sense of agency and are less likely to default to me. Camila is rebuilding, imperfectly, bravely, and sometimes slowly. There are days when she is cheerful and other days when the weight of starting again drags her down. Through it all, her daughters keep being the center, untroubled by adult complexities in ways that feel both painful and restorative. I can't promise the future. People change at their own pace, and habits return as easily as they are broken. But now the family leans toward practical action rather than dramatic gestures. We measure help in calendars and pick-up times rather than guilt. That shift may sound small, but it rewired how we operate and how we see one another. If someone asked me to summarize the ending in one sentence, I'd say this: boundaries saved a marriage and created space for a family to reconfigure itself honestly, even if that process came with pain. The work isn't finished. The emotional wounds are still tender. But I have hope, not because everything was resolved with ease, but because the people involved started to show up in realistic, reparable ways. In the quiet moments now, I sometimes think of the younger Camila who used to climb trees with me and plan ridiculous future adventures. I hope she rediscovers parts of that self that didn't depend on someone else's approval. I hope she learns to say no gently but firmly, to pick herself first in ways that weren't selfish but restorative. I also hope I remember the lessons of holding my own life tenderly and keeping my yes meaningful. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and comment. Thanks for your attention.